Hey everybody, I'm Adam Weiss. I'm an MBA student here at Franciscan, and this is my presentation on The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump for a communication workshop. The basic layout of the book is it's a memoir, a success story, and a business plan laid out by Mr. Donald Trump, talking about his early life and how he attained the success that he got, and how you could potentially do it too. The writing style, Trump lays out most of his basic business plan in about the second chapter, talking about his 11 keys to business. The rest of the book is mostly just case studies, looking at different deals he's made and how he's used these keys to business to help him negotiate and communicate more effectively to achieve his own goals and desires in business dealings. Just a little background on the author, since a lot of this book is autobiographical. He was born in 1946. His father did a lot of real estate flipping and investment during the Great Depression in the early 20th century, buying a lot of rent-controlled housing in the outer boroughs of New York. Trump went into business with his father early on and eventually decided he wanted to do more than just rent control and started to move up buying bigger and bigger lots and making larger and larger deals. Eventually he had success with Trump Tower and several different casinos in Atlantic City that we'll talk about in a bit. Not in the book, but he's also the star of The Apprentice. It's been nominated for several Emmys, and he's a current candidate for the Republican nomination for president. The business advice he lays out are his 11 keys to understanding business. Think big, protect the downside, and the upsides will handle themselves. Maximize your options, know your market, use your leverage, enhance your location, get the word out, fight back, deliver the goods, contain the costs, and have fun. In the subsequent slides, we'll look a little bit more in depth into each one of these and how we can apply them. Number one was think big. Trump's main point is that you should always look for the biggest reward and the biggest payout. He didn't like small timing it, nickel and diming people in the rent controlled business, so he likes to look at the possibilities, and that's how he's attained a lot of his success, is looking at what look like impossible odds to make a very large payoff. He always wants the biggest, the best, and to be the greatest. He wants the Trump name to go farther, and if you want to follow in his footsteps, you need to be willing to go big or go home, to aim for the stars and get as much as possible out of each deal. Protect the downsides and the upsides will handle himself. He talks about himself as a very conservative businessman. Although he looks at the possibilities, he'll never make a deal without protecting himself from the negatives. He doesn't want to make any deal where the absolute worst case scenario is something he can't live with. He's made the exception once, and it was to buy a team in the United States Football League, which we'll get to in a moment, and it did not pan out as well for him. He always likes to insulate himself from risk as much as possible, making deals with partners who are willing to take on a little bit of that risk to use his expertise in manipulating different aspects of deal making. Maximize your options. Mr. Trump advises that everybody should stay flexible. Try and keep as many possible outs in a deal as possible. If you buy a piece of land as he did, he always wanted to make sure that even if his grand proposal didn't work out, he could still make his money back somehow, whether it be demolishing the lot and reselling the land for a slight profit, continuing renting out different portions of it, or trying to convince the city to come in and purchase the land. Know your market. Mr. Trump doesn't like polls. He doesn't like marketing research. He doesn't trust it. So he likes to go out and get to know people on the street in the areas he's looking to invest in. He very much likes to keep his thumb on the pulse of the world, and especially in New York City. He had an opportunity to make a very large amount of money creating the world's largest casino in Australia and decided not to because he didn't know the market well enough. And his basic motto is the more you know, the safer you are, going back to protecting the downsides. Use your leverage. Mr. Trump argues that the best thing you can have in a deal is leverage. And if you don't have any, salesmanship and showmanship can make people think that you do. Make them think you have something that they absolutely need. And the worst possible thing you can do in deal making is look desperate. If you look desperate for a piece of land or for a property, for whatever you're going for, people are going to gouge you to to get what they want out of you so that you can get what they obviously know you need. So the best opportunity in a deal is for you to have a lot of leverage and your opponent to not have any. Enhance your location. Mr. Trump talks about the old rules of real estate being location, 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 and argues that the best location is not always um, absolutely necessary for a deal to work or for an idea to pay off, but you have to have at least a decent location at a decent price, and you've got to be willing to put in the work to design newer features or some way to make the location better than it was before so that you gain something out of it. You have to put in the work to add value, and that you should never pay too much. Even if there's a prime piece of property that you really, really would like to build on, if the price is too high, you're never going to make the profit you want on it. So pay what you need, but not so much that it ruins you. Get the word out. People need to know what you have to offer. If you don't market what you're selling, no one's going to come. One of the big successes for Trump Tower was that he really marketed it as the new place to be for the young wealthy and the new up and coming foreign nationals who had a ton of wealth to come in. He made it to where people wanted to live there, and he sold out all of the apartments very, very quickly using this. He also talks about understanding the press, using free publicity by being a little controversial, being different, and just really getting out there and just throwing your point out into the wind and letting the press run with it. He talks about how his bravado helps to attract the press and to get his point across. And you can even see that today. He really uses the free press that he gets with his presidential candidacy. He hasn't spent a lot on ad buys, but he's got a ton of free publicity from all the just very controversial statements he's been making in his presidential race. But he does the same thing in business. He creates these huge ideas and just throws out these really controversial and big statements, like creating the world's tallest building, and it gets him a lot of free press that he then uses to make some money. Fight back. He really does not like being treated unfairly. Whenever he believes that he's not getting the correct end of the deal, whether it be from city planning commissions, zoning commissions, a negotiation partner, he's unwilling to back down. And even when it starts costing him, he'll keep pushing and pushing and pushing to try and keep from seeming weak. One of his arguments is that once people see you as weak, that's all they'll ever see you as, even if you only back down once. So it's better to press and press, even if it costs you a little more now, instead of ruining your reputation in the future. And to not necessarily shy away from conflict, but to use the fact that there are problems to your advantage. Showing that there's a conflict means that there's something valuable there. Number 9, deliver the goods. Nobody likes getting nothing. If you can't deliver, no one really cares what your proposition is. A lot of his deals come from the fact that people with prime pieces of property may be offered more by other buyers, but they'll see a lot of their deals fall through before closing because people can't follow through. Trump's main argument for the beginning of his career was that he always came through on the deals he set up. He always made sure he had the money. He always made sure he had a way to go through. He'd set up a lot of contingency plans, a lot of very strange contract riders and that kind of thing, but he used them to make sure that he'd always have everything in place to make sure he could commit to a deal before it was struck. One of his arguments is cons can only last so long. You can only keep an act of success up for so long, and his argument for why he's lasted so long in the real estate business is he doesn't act. He may have a big public persona, but when it comes to making a deal, he always makes sure he can follow through with what he starts. 10, contain the costs. As we all know from our different MBA classes, costs are one of the driving factors of profits. If your costs are too high, you're not going to make a profit no matter how great of a product you're selling. So whenever Trump starts a project, since he's both a real estate purchaser, buyer, and seller, and also a builder, his main focus is on cutting the costs as much as possible, but not going so low with bargain basement contractors as to ruin the workmanship. So he never spends more than he should, but that doesn't mean he doesn't spend as much as he needs to. He always makes sure that what needs to be done gets done, and one of the anecdotes that he puts out is people still mock him a little bit, his brother and other large people in the business, for calling down to contractors to save $5, $10, $15,000 on a $500 million job. but he says that the day that he can't make a 25-cent phone call to save $10,000 is the day he'll get out of business, and that these pennies add up. He does also say that the time value of money means you got to focus on what you're doing. You can't continually waste time and waste your own valuable labor and time on useless nickel and diming, but you should be willing to put in a little bit of time and effort into making sure you get the best deal you can. And his last tip is to have fun. He really enjoys deal making, and one of the arguments he makes is if you really hate what you're doing, if you hate the negotiation process, you're not going to do the best at it. If you can't enjoy what you're doing, you're not going to have your heart in it, and you're not going to put the most in that you can. And that a lot of the reason people don't like negotiating is they get too bogged down in the minutiae and the details. They don't enjoy the act of making a deal. They don't enjoy negotiating. They don't enjoy the little bit of conflict and putting brass tacks together to come up with a better system and a better deal. So the first real chapter after that is growing up. It basically talks about the early life of Trump. When he was a kid, he was a little bit rambunctious. He was always very in your face. Some would say arrogant. His father sent him to a military academy for his years through high school, and he very quickly learned that there are some people that you can't just bully around. He had a drill sergeant as a teacher, and one of the things he learned is you had to talk with him, you had to negotiate, you had to make him think that what you were offering was in his best interest, and it was one of his first experiences in using negotiation to get what he wants. The Cincinnati Kid. Here he talks about one of the first deals he made coming out of high school with his father. They bought a place called Swifton Village in Cincinnati. It was a fairly low to middle income rental area, basically just a large apartment building. And the company that was selling it was basically facing bankruptcy and had no real option. He bought it for next to nothing and used some very good funding that he had received and some financing to make sure he could fix it up enough that he could get in better rent. They had what were called trailer watches. They had seen a lot of the lower income people who were skipping out on rent go in the middle of the night, take their stuff out into a trailer and drive off. So he instituted putting in watchmen, and he found a really good manager, which is one of his other tips, is get good people. Get to know who you're working with. The guy he hired was a little crooked. He was never fully convinced that he wasn't stealing from him, but he figured that at 50,000 a year for a salary and probably another 50,000 stolen from the books, it was still a bargain because the manager he had knew how to communicate with his underlings and keep the lower level employees in check and was able to manage Swifton Village very, very well. Um, and with his argument that you've got to know your market, he'd constantly come back and check in on Swifton Village and see how well it was doing and talk with the residents. And they began to see that the area around Swifton Village was starting to go downhill and was starting to get a little unsafe. They were losing some renters. So he struck a deal to sell while Swifton Village was still very, very profitable. But before it started to go downhill with the neighborhood starting to affect it. So he put in contract riders that he could guarantee 100% occupancy at the time that they set the deal and that they signed the contract, but not at the time of closing. And doing that, he insulated himself because the vacancy rates went way, way up as the area continually got worse and worse, and as leases came up, and he was able to get out right before the collapse of that area. Move to Manhattan. Trump talks about how he had always wanted to make deals in the big city and especially on the island. He had grown up in the outer boroughs working with his dad, buying stuff in Queens and Brooklyn, all these different areas in the Bronx, but he really, really wanted to get onto the island and he wanted to work with Manhattan. His first real deal in New York, in Manhattan, was to buy a set of rail yards on the west side. There was a railroad company that was going under, and he used that leverage to get options on the 30th Street and 60th Street rail yards. And he eventually ended up buying the 30th Street rail yards because it looked like the better deal. And although he couldn't quite get rental stuff and any kind of bigger system set up, he was able to negotiate with the city. And even though New York at that point was in a pretty bad depression, they were willing to talk about bringing a convention center in, and Trump was able to convince them that his 30th Street yard was the best possible place for that convention center to go in, and it made him a very hefty profit on the deal. The Grand Hotel, he worked with the same rail company for this one, and he talks about how you kind of have to get to know the people that you're working with, and when you're negotiating with old partners, you've got to understand you can't go quite as hard for the absolute cost cutting, and that if you keep friendly terms with them, you'll often find new opportunities coming around on the horizon. What they had going on was the rail the railroad company that he had purchased the West Side Yards from had three hotels that they were operating. Two of them were fairly successful, and there was the Commodore, which is the hotel you'll see in the lower right corner of the screen. Um, the Commodore was having a little bit of difficulty. They were running majorly in the red, and so Trump offered to purchase it. He came up with a plan, and he did some basic low-level renovations instead of tearing it down, and made it into the little gleaming mirror image that you see on the very right side of the screen, and netted a tidy profit from the operations of it because he made it stand out because it was right across from Grand Central Station. Um, it was a great location, but when you tried to blend in with the neighborhood, people just overlooked it, and it was so old. It was a has-been hotel. He decided that he'd work with a little bit better. He'd improve it, and he'd make it ostentatious that people wanted to go there. Trump Tower. This was his first real aspect of branding something as his own. He found a really great location right next to Tiffany and Co. And he decided that he was going to create this great apartment and retail section that everybody would want to be in the middle of the city. Um, Nobody had been able to build on the site because of the different zoning laws. You'd have to get air rights, which are the right to build over top of a building, and a bunch of different little parcels. It was such a pain to rezone it that nobody had looked into taking over this strip of land. And one of the things was, as he was continually fighting with the zoning board, he kept his options open so that he always had another way out, so that the zoning board never had full leverage over him. And he always made sure that the financing was coming from the bank and he wasn't putting himself personally at risk. So that he always had the ability to live with if nothing went through properly, he wouldn't be ruined in business. Gaming. Right about the time that he finished Trump Tower, Atlantic City started to debate legalizing gambling in its city. So he recognized the opportunity that was after seeing Hilton's stock plummet after their two casinos had strikes in Nevada and having 40% of their stock price disappear. Um, he looked at that and began to see that a casino is basically a license to print money. One of the things he noticed was the Atlantic City Board was not very friendly when offering out permits and licensing to different casino operators, and that a lot of different places had started construction and seeking a license at the same time, and that this didn't pay off for them, since the Gaming Control Board had so much power, since the licensing authority had so much leverage over them. They were able to demand that they fire certain managers and all this, and these other companies didn't have an option because they had sunk so much money into these sites. Trump purchased a fairly reasonable chunk of land on the boardwalk, organized a couple of different deals to bring together the final piece of property that he designed, and it's right next to the convention center in Atlantic City, which plays in a little later. He was able to build a parking garage and funnel people through, almost doubling and tripling his profits by creating that throughfare through the plaza. But he eventually got his license and came to a deal with Holiday Inn, who offered him to buy in all of the investment that he'd already put in and to cover the operating expenses, manage the hotel, and guarantee him against losses for 5 years in agreement for 50% of the ownership of the the hotel casino that they eventually built. Trump talks about how this really pays into his idea of protecting the downsides. Look at it. Yes, he didn't get quite as big of a share in the upside, but he absolutely insulated himself from risk for 5 years. Took anything that he had already put up away, and still stood to make 50% of the profits from it. He says it was a no-brainer. He needed to move forward, and Holiday Inn made a great partner. They brought in a manager. He had no real experience working in the gaming industry, and with the partnership, he stood to make a lot of money, and he continued on with it for quite a while. Windfall. This talks about utilizing an opponent's mistakes. What happened was Mr. Wynn, the operator of the Golden Nugget Casino in Atlantic City, made a run at the Hilton Corporation. They had tried to buy out several shares to try and undermine Mr. Hilton, the um, heir who did not have a sizable amount of stock. He had only really kept a ceremonial position because of his father's will, but he didn't have a controlling interest. And as Wynn tried to make a run at the company, Mr. Hilton realized that what he really wanted was Hilton's casino in Atlantic City, and that if he could divest himself of that, he'd be in much safer control of the company. And instead of selling directly to Wynn because of such an aggressive move, he started into negotiations with Trump. And Trump made a fairly decent deal with him and credits the fact that Hilton sold it all to the fact that Mr. Wynn had made such an aggressive move and had really insulted him by looking at going after the company. Um, Trump used the leverage that Hilton really needed to sell right now to maintain control of his company to make sure he got the utmost deal. And as Hilton got better and better offers, Trump used the fact that they already had a deal in the works and a couple of really nice exclusivity clauses to try and lock it down to really leverage Hilton to make sure he came through on the deal. Trump renamed the casino Trump's Castle, and it became his second casino in Atlantic City. And he put Ivana Trump, his wife, in charge of it with the argument that you really need to know the people and that he could trust her to manage it with his best interests in mind instead of her own. And it did end up paying off. They made quite a big deal of money throughout the following years. Low rent, high stakes. Mr. Trump ended up buying two parcels of land that were right next to each other, the Barbizon Plaza Hotel and 100 Central Park South. They're two pieces right next to each other, and he was initially planning to build a very large office and residential building on there so that he could get much, much higher rents. But with the rent control systems in place, it became much harder to vacate the two buildings so that he could tear them down and build. And the residents, the tenants in the building, decided to file suit for harassment and a lot of other complaints to try and continually slow him down because of the rent controls in New York. They had a lot of really good apartments for a lot cheaper than they should have because of the freezing of rents. So as the years went on, Trump, although he had to pay the carrying costs, the housing market in New York uh, got much, much better. It improved significantly. And he talks about how, although he had planned to build a very large tower there, um, the delay that the tenants had forced him into made made a lot of opportunities apparent to him. He had the ability to look at the new market and buy a different hotel across the street from his current one, shut down the Barbizon, and renovate both hotels and start renting them out for much, much higher rents since the market had rebounded. And he made a lot of money on the deal because he was willing to reconsider what his original plans were and look at the new lay of the land that his opponents had forced him into and still make the best of a bad situation. Long shot. This is one of the few failures that Trump had. He purchased the New Jersey Generals in the United States Football League. They were a losing team, and he managed to turn the team around. They became about a 9-4 team by the end of it. He bought a lot of really high talented players, Herschel Walker, and several high name quarterbacks from the 80s to bring him in. And he basically used his powers of negotiation to convince the other owners of USFL teams that they really needed to go head to head with the NFL and try and fight them in an antitrust lawsuit. Trump was fairly certain he could win it, and that regardless, he'd at least have some fun owning a sports team and trying to take down a major monopoly. But the thing is, the United States Football League couldn't really make a ton of money without an antitrust suit victory. And what ended up happening is they pushed their suit through, and they were successful in showing that the NFL had some very anti-competitive policies and had functioned as a monopoly with control of the three major cable networks for game footage. But the jury only awarded them $1 token damages that really helped them not at all and didn't force the NFL to leave a network open to negotiations with the USFL. One of the problems that Trump had was, although he looked into who he was dealing with, a lot of the other managers didn't have the money to invest to make the United States Football League a truly competitive league. A lot of them wanted to stay in the spring season where there wasn't as much competition with the NFL. They didn't have the money to sign high caliber talent, and they didn't have what it took to force the league into competition. And with their weakness, the whole league kind of failed. They appealed the decision, but without major damages being awarded or the ability to get a decent TV contract, the league folded, and Trump basically lost out on that one. Ice capades. The Woolman Rink in Central Park had been a public embarrassment after the city closed it down for renovations and took 6 years to try and make it work. They spent $13 million and they had nothing really to show for it. They tried a lot of different new ideas because they hadn't really gotten to know what they were working with. And Trump eventually decided to come in, talk to the city council, talk to the mayor, and convince them to finally allow him to take over the project as kind of a charity thing. He put up $3 million of his own money to be paid back on completion, no interest, no nothing. And he took in one of the main things he did was he looked for experts in the field and he made sure that he talked with them to so that he knew what he was doing. Instead of putting in the Freon system that the city had initially considered, he put in an older but and less efficient brine system, but it was much more capable of dealing with the stresses that were going to be put under it with all of the concrete. He made sure that all of the concrete came in and poured at the same time, which is very important to creating a level and consistent base. And he talked about how you really have to keep on contracts. You have to talk with them and make them understand that to continue working with you, they need to provide a good product at the price they agreed with. The city had gone through millions and millions of cost overruns, whereas Trump came in $750,000 under budget by the end and finished a month early by making sure that he was in constant discussion with his contract. He was always present there. He came down, he said daily, he'd always look at what was going on and he'd make sure that everything was up to par. And with that, he was able to forge better relationships with the contractors and make sure that everything went as planned, that the hierarchy that he had set up executed his plan and got the Woolman Rink ready by December. Comeback. This is where Trump talks about how you don't pay more than you should. He didn't have a very good option on the rail yards that he had purchased for the convention center, so he released his option on 60th Street, on the 60th Street block, and he cut his losses there. But when they came back up for sale again at a lower price in a better market, he jumped on it immediately. And he saw a very distinct opportunity with NBC threatening to leave New York after several tax changes and that kind of stuff. He secured several tax abatements because he was willing to cater to NBC's desires by creating a new studio space, giving them almost 2 million square feet of studios in what he was dubbing Television City, that was going to overlook the Hudson River and offer retail space, residential areas, parks, boardwalks, all kinds of different things that would appeal to both the city to make sure that he'd get his zoning, NBC to make sure they'd stay there, and make sure that he could still make a lot of money. So with NBC deciding that it was either going to move to New Jersey or take Trump's position, he used that leverage to make sure that the zoning committee approved his deal, and that the city council approved a tax abatement to make sure that he could make money on the program. He made sure that he had the leverage. He made sure that he knew what the market was. He basically just looked through and made sure that everything was in place, that the deal would work out. And he always had plans. If NBC didn't come through, he had other buyers looking in. He had people ready to buy apartments in the towers that he was going to build. And he really covered every aspect and every angle of the deal. And the week that was, this is basically a summary of all of the discussions from A Week in the Life that he had earlier in the book, talking about all the deals, how he had been working with Woolman Rink, how he had been building the parking garage for Trump Plaza, and all of these deals. Um, it's basically just whether or not he was successful in each one. It continues to talk about how the USFL wasn't working out, and it's just talking about how he resolved a lot of the deals that he had had. And the conclusions I've come to, Trump is very business savvy and knows that his ambition and his caution have to be paired with knowledge. Um, and that as much fun as he has in the business, he can't get too emotionally attached to any one deal. He has to be willing to walk away if the money isn't there. The 11 steps he lays out really get to the core of how negotiations ought to work and how business in general should work. The case studies that he sets up, even though he doesn't call them as much, really help to show how the lessons ought to be applied, and shows that he really believes in them because he implements them in his own life, and that's one of the best ways he's been able to make money. The book was all in all a good read, and the information was very helpful.